This is Platemark. My name is Ann Shafer, and I am your host. I'm an independent curator specializing in prints and printmaking. You have found us at Series 3 of Platemark. These are the interviews I'm doing with fabulous and wonderful people who work in the print ecosystem. That could be artists, could be curators, it could be gallerists or printers, you name it. Today's guest is Emma Nishimura. She is an artist who lives in Toronto, and she is a fabulous artist. I can't wait for you guys to hear and see what she's up to. Let's see, before we get rolling, my positionality, I always want to make it clear. It's only right. My pronouns are she, her. I identify as a cishet white woman. I record Platemark in Baltimore, Maryland, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people. Any images that Emma and I speak about will be available over on the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. Also over on platemarkpodcast.com, you'll find a little microphone icon. You can leave me a 60-second voicemail, ask me a question, or just leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. And also, hit the support and donate button and help me keep the lights on here at Platemark. I'd really, really appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. All right, let's get rolling. Emma, it is so great to see you. Thank you for coming on Platemark.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you introduce yourself for our listeners?
Absolutely. My name is Emma Nishimura. I'm an artist, primarily working in printmaking. I'm based in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I teach at the Ontario College of Art and Design University. Yeah, I've been having a pretty active practice for the last 10, 15 years.
It seems like it. I didn't know about you until a show at the Print Center in New York, which was 2018, I think. Yeah. And I remember walking in there, and we'll put some pictures up of the installation of just like I walked right over to the little sculptural pouches on the wall, and I just I want one. They were so beautiful, but we'll get to that soon. So you're up in Toronto. You're Canadian born, right?
Yes.
From Vancouver, maybe?
No, born in Toronto.
Oh, okay. Oh, good.
Yeah.
I always love to ask people about, when did you figure out that you were going to be an artist? And I mean, did you run into any roadblocks? Like my dad saying, "Don't do that."
Yeah. I think I always loved to make things. And I had a very supportive family. I was taking pottery classes as early as junior kindergarten. Started taking sewing classes in grade 3. I was always making things. And my first real introduction to printmaking was, I think I was in about grade 10. And me and one other kid from my high school got to go to this week-long art camp. And I was able to do print all week, which was amazing. And we were cutting out pieces of cardboard and inking them up and printing them through. And I thought this was the best thing ever.
You mean sort of like a collagraph thing?
Exactly, like a collagraph.
Yeah. Hey, it's Anne breaking in just to say I don't think we've ever talked about collagraph specifically. So I'll describe it. You have a substrate that's very stiff, cardboard, masonite maybe even, and you create images on it using a glue. You can paint the glue on to have all of these weird textures and peaks and valleys, or you can even glue down lace or anything like that. So then you can ink it up either intaglio or you can roll it across the top in relief, or you can do both. Yeah. Back to the show.
It was kind of a mixture of relief and collagraph, and it was just a delightful experience, and I loved the process. But I think if anything, the roadblocks were it was me. I was the roadblock, saying, I need a degree, I need to make a living, and the life of an artist looked pretty challenging. So initially I was going to be a doctor, and then I changed to go into psychology. So I ended up doing a double major in psychology and fine art. Initially, studio art was just my minor, but then I was able to do a double major. And then partway through university, I realized that, studio was where I wanted to be, and making art, thinking about art was really how I wanted to spend my life. And so I did manage to complete my double major, but my real focus was on the art side of things.
Right. Well, yes, every parent wants their child to major in something that might lead to a job. But then you went on to graduate school in Lincoln, right?
I did, yes.
What made you come to the States?
I graduated. I took about 5 years off before grad school, and was working as a technician at the Art University in Toronto, at OCADU, and had a bunch of different opportunities in the print world, which was lovely. And I knew I needed to get out of Toronto. I was teaching, I was being a tech, I was doing lots of shows and kind of spread thin. And I knew I needed to go somewhere, and I wanted to immerse myself in school. And so there were a couple Canadian options and then lots of American options. and then I got some great funding at a really wonderful school that had a great printmaking program and great print faculty.
Who were the faculty members there?
So Karen Kuntz and Francisco Soto. I was able to study with both of them and work with lots of other great faculty. It was wonderful. And then also interesting because my first year of that program, I didn't make a single print. Oh no, maybe my first semester I did, but then after that, I spent a year not making any prints. I was sewing and making sculptures and thinking about my work differently. And it was so lovely to be in an environment where I didn't have to think about selling my work to make a living. I didn't have to think about kind of teaching. It was just really immersing myself in the ideas and in the process and getting kind of absorbed in the work.
Do you feel like your experience playing with sculpture and three-dimensional forms led you to, I mean, your prints, quote unquote, are not on the walls at all. Well,
Some
a couple
are.
of them are.
Some are, yeah.
Some are.
Many aren't, yeah.
Yeah, many aren't. I mean, you're much more, you have integrated the three-dimensional aspects of it, I think, as well as anyone I've ever seen.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think for me, it's been, I grew up just loving working with different materials and working with Japanese paper always. I think I was in grade 3 and I did a speech to my class on washi, on Japanese paper.
And again, I don't think we've talked about washi papers. Washi is the Japanese word for the traditional papers made from long inner fibers of 3 specific plants, kozo, mitsumata, and gampi. And washi, the word wa means Japanese and shi means paper. So it's an umbrella term.
We have this amazing resource in Toronto called the Japanese Paper Place, and my mom knew about it, and so we would go there and buy wonderful paper and make things. And so I met the owner early on, Nancy Jacoby, and have known her what feels like my whole life. And so there was a way that I was very comfortable working with washi and with Japanese paper. So it lends itself really naturally to working sculpturally. When I figured out I could print on washi and then sew it and fold it and do all sorts of things, then kind of a whole new world opened up for me in terms of my work.
So for our listeners who may be unfamiliar with what washi feels like and what makes it different than other papers, can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, Japanese paper comes in any range of thicknesses. I particularly like to work with really thin paper. You can print on it when it's wet, you can print on it when it's dry, but also it looks very delicate and looks like it could kind of fall apart very easily, but it's really, really strong. And so it's all of these different factors that lend itself so well to working in such a range of ways. So initially, when I first used it, I was working with shinkole and working with etchings and kind of working in a more traditional approach. And then I started to not work with Western paper so much, and I skipped the shinkole part, and I just went straight onto the Japanese paper.
And when did you start realizing you could sew it into forms and more sculptural aspects?
So what really happened for me was, I think it was about 2008. I'd gotten a grant from the Ontario government to create a body of work about what it was to be mixed race. So my mom's side of the family is Scottish Canadian, but very Canadian, and my dad's side of the family is Japanese Canadian. My grandparents were actually both born in Vancouver, so it was I'm 4th generation half. But I had proposed to do this body of work of what it was to be mixed, and so I went to my mom's house and tried to find all these old family photo albums, and I couldn't find any of the albums. But I came across this box labeled Bachun sewing patterns. And so Bachun means grandmother in Japanese. And basically when she had died about 4 years before that, and anything that was sewing related had just come to my mom's basement for me. I had sewn lots growing up and had even spent a weekend sewing with my grandmother once when I was 13, and said that would never happen again.
Right, I know.
She was very particular.
I bet.
So I found this and I opened up this box, and inside were over 200 articles of tiny paper clothing, all kind of ranging between like 5 and 8 inches tall and just beautifully made, all out of brown craft paper. And there were 5 books of patterns that went along with them.
Were the patterns commercial patterns that she was then making these little models out of, or was it her model patterns?
She was taking a drafting course. So the pattern books were labeled 1941. And so she had taken this drafting course when she was 18 in Vancouver. And at that time, there weren't a lot of different options available to Japanese Canadian women for employment. So a lot of women were taking these drafting courses. And so the patterns there are all these flat patterns of, I think, kind of her tracings of these Vogue, kind of these amazing drawings of the figures wearing the clothes, but then the flat patterns for the clothing. And so she had kind of meticulously done all of it. And the text inside is a mixture of English and Japanese. And then inside one of those booklets was this sheaf of notebook paper labeled 1943 in the summer. And she was making clothes for other internees when she was interned during the war as a Japanese Canadian. And so my work since then has really all stemmed from that box. And finding all of these sewn garments, kind of coming back to that initial question, I learned how to read her patterns and started sewing my own kind of small miniature garments out of paper, wanting to echo her use of paper. Then I was working instead of with craft paper, with Japanese paper. And then I started printing on the paper and working those kind of seamlessly together, creating images where these garments kind of disappear into a landscape.
Yeah, they're sort of set on a land. Yes, they're quite eerie and wonderful in that way.
Yeah, initially I was thinking about how kind of the forced assimilation that happened after the war for my grandparents. When the war ended, the Canadian government said you have to move east or you can, quote unquote, repatriate to Japan. Whereas most of them were Canadian citizens.
Of course.
And Japanese Canadians weren't actually allowed to return to the coast until 1949.
I'm shaking my head, listeners. I'm sorry. I think Americans, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second. American audiences are fully aware of our similar situation in the United States with internment camps. But I think that probably they're less aware that the same situation was going on in Canada and that there's this like a parallel line historically between the two.
Yeah, so many parallels, but also some differences. So Japanese Canadians' land and possessions were sold to, quote, pay for their incarceration. So then my grandparents had no property to go back to. But then they also weren't allowed to go back until 49, at which point they had already settled elsewhere. There is no official Japantown in Canada. I mean, some have popped up now, but whereas in the States, there's at least 3 in California. Things were able to happen. Communities were able to reform because that land wasn't sold right away. People were allowed to go back to the coast after the war, whereas in Canada, it was so delayed.
Did they say why the delay? They were concerned for national security?
Oh, I'm sure there was
some reason or another.
It was really about assimilation. And it was about not wanting the community that had formed on the West Coast to form again. If you force everyone to disperse, then it won't happen. And I think it was twofold too, because then after the war, my grandparents and their generation didn't want to ever relive that experience. So it was about assimilating. My dad was born in 46, and his first day of kindergarten, his teacher said to my grandparents, we can't understand your son, because he was only speaking Japanese because they spoke Japanese at home. And so then from that day on, my grandparents stopped speaking Japanese. It was, okay, we have to do this. We have to be, quote unquote, Canadian. it's very tricky. And one of the reasons that I've kept coming back to this history is the reverberations that have continued to happen throughout the generations. People often say, oh, you've got Japanese in you, can you speak Japanese? Can you, all of these things? And I said, no, I can't speak Japanese because of this history. And it's all very layered and very complicated, as all history is. Yeah, kind of complex layers that has been, it's just felt time for me and my own family history to really explore it and learn more about my grandparents' experience, and understand kind of why I knew so little growing up, really, of their history.
Because they wouldn't talk about it.
Wouldn't talk about it too much.
Yeah.
So my grandparents growing up, I think my mom, who was the daughter-in-law, maybe felt like she had more permission to ask questions than my dad did. So my sister and I would sit around the table and listen to stories, but we would just listen. My grandfather died when I was young, and so did my dad. And then my grandmother told some stories, and I'd say kind of towards the end of her life, she was talking about these stories more. When I eventually found these photo albums, I talked to my aunt about them, and she said, when we looked at those albums when we were kids, my grandfather, her father, just said, that's where I worked, on the road camps. He didn't ever tell her that they were road camps.
Whoa.
My dad and aunt, they didn't really find out anything about the internment until the 70s, probably until they were in their early 20s.
What?
Because it was about moving on and not addressing it and moving forward.
Right.
So there's been so much silence connected with the internment. And I would say that's pretty common amongst many Japanese Canadian households, and my guess, many Japanese American households too.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's sort of a cultural duty and don't make the waves and that kind of a thing. That is my impression.
It's been more than a decade now that my work has really focused on these stories. And it's interesting, people have said over the years, if you didn't find that box, what would you be doing? And I think if I hadn't found that box, I think I probably still would have been telling this story, because it was a story that I've always known that needed to be told, but the work might look a little bit different. Hard to know.
Right. But this points to something that I've said many a time, listeners will know, that artists are uniquely qualified to bring these kinds of ideas into the fore in objects that aren't, terrifying, frightening, not to be talked about, but that you're investing these objects with these ideas about layering of memory and family history and, what is home and carrying home with you and all of that stuff. And I feel like the Canadians are doing a better job of acknowledging some of those histories, like all the boarding schools for the Native kids and I feel like you guys are doing a way better job with land acknowledgements. And, I don't know. I feel like you guys are doing a better job.
Well,
I not feel that way to you.
I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
Of course.
Totally. I think there's a lot of good intentions right now around Indigenous histories and all of the residential school systems. I think there's, a lot of work and a lot of space that needs to be made to acknowledge this history. But definitely, I think kind of culturally, there is a recognition that we need to be paying attention and listening. And I agree. I think artists are in this unique position to talk about these histories and to have different kinds of conversations and to invite different people in to have these conversations in non-threatening ways, in ways that we can kind of break down some of these stories and also be inclusive. I think one of the interesting things over the years of doing my work and talking about my work has then been sharing it with other people who then share their own stories and their own histories. A lot of my work talks about memory and the incompleteness of the record of the story, of missing these fragments. And I've had conversations with people who have Alzheimer's disease or have family members who do, and who have said, this is what it's like when you know that it's gone, but you just can't place it and you can't fill in that information. To then people who have kind of very different family histories from different parts in the globe, but there are so many similarities, which is quite depressing from a global perspective. But
right, of course.
Here we are.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like memory is such a tough subject for art. Like I've done enough critiquing down at the art school in Baltimore, MICA, and have run into students who are making work about their grandmothers, or and it sometimes is so simplistic
Mm-hmm.
and too connected to their own personal experience, so that it's not as relatable out in the greater world. I mean, people look at art and have enough trouble reading it and figuring out what it's about, right? But if it's, behind this cloak of me and grandma had this particular whatever it was, I think that's what I appreciate about your work so much, that even if I don't have the cultural idea of wrapping a present in a cloth
Mm-hmm.
and carrying that with you, I feel like I can completely imagine an empty, well, maybe you should describe them for us, an empty vessel full of potential memories that nobody will ever know, but there's
Mm-hmm.
just this grasping for,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I wish I knew what had happened,
Mm-hmm.
back then. And I mean, we all have that, all that regret that nobody wrote things down. Why don't you tell us about the archive, the Rememory archive?
Will do, yes. So my series, An Archive of Rememory, it really grew out of all these amazing photographs of my grandparents when they were interned, of my grandfather working in these road camps, of my grandmother in these camps with her girlfriends. Some of them are these delightful photos. They've all signed kind of autographs of each other.
Do you know who was taking the pictures?
No.
Wow.
And so this is all part of the challenges. Is so I found all these albums after they had died. And I do remember my grandmother showing one album to us, but I didn't ever ask those questions. And so I have so many questions.
Right.
When the order was announced that the internment was happening and that everyone was going to be incarcerated, all cameras were taken away. They weren't allowed to bring any of those. However, for other series of works, I've been interviewing different Japanese Canadians and recording oral histories. And what I've discovered is that people were able to order cameras by mail from the Eaton's catalog and have them shipped to them. So it wasn't just a professional photographer taking these photos. Kind of different community members were able to purchase cameras and document things. So I don't know if they were my grandmother's or if it was friend, hard to know. But we do have a couple different albums. And so I had all these photographs, and it was this challenge of kind of all throughout this is, how do I tell their story and how do I share it and invite people in beyond, here's this photo album that's amazing, come look at it. And I'd done a lot of work with photo intaglio processes. Initially, I started with some photogravure prints. When I was in grad school, I took an amazing workshop at Anderson Ranch with Lothar Osterberg and made some beautiful photogravure prints with him. And then I came back to grad school and started printing them on paper, but then they were just the same photograph from the photo album. And things didn't feel like they were doing quite enough. And so it took a while to figure out what things were really going to look like. But then after grad school, when I was back in Toronto, I took a papermaking workshop with a great papermaking studio in Toronto called Paper House. And it was a sculptural papermaking workshop. And I discovered that I could print these photo intaglio and photo etching plates onto handmade paper. And then I could wrap this handmade paper around a mold, basically a mold of sand. And then the handmade paper dries, and it's a special paper. The pulp has been beaten much longer than usual. So when it dries, it shrinks because these fibers are so short. And so the paper and the photograph essentially shrink around this object, and I'm able to drain out the sand and create these kind of hollow sculptures. The form that I was using is called a Furoshiki. It's a traditional Japanese wrapping technique where you take a square of cloth or paper and you can wrap up a gift. And the Furoshiki has, a history from, many hundreds of years, but kind of in its contemporary context, you can wrap up your lunch, you can give a gift, you can, kind of wrap up your belongings. And so I loved this idea of this multi-purpose square of paper that I could kind of wrap up these memories and create an archive of sorts. Over the years, I think I've made probably over about 400 of them. And initially, I started using kind of all photographs from these albums of my grandparents and their friends. But then the project is growing and will continue to grow to then include other photographs from other Japanese Canadians so that I create this larger archive. And when you see the works, they're, I don't know, kind of fit in the palm of your hand, as you said, Anne. It's feeling like you want to pick them up, but requesting that people don't or hold back that urge.
Right.
And they look really heavy because they're printed with pretty dark ink, but they actually weigh nothing. And one of the other elements of them that I love is that you would want to open them. There's that feeling of wanting to open them and wanting to know what's inside, but you can't, in the same way that I can't find all of these answers to all of these questions I have. Having the paper dry the way it does, you actually can't unwrap these sculptures in any way.
To do so would be to destroy it. You'd have to cut it open.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. And if you opened it, it wouldn't have the answers for you.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's the perfect conceptual circle.
It is.
When they were on the wall, they were on these little pretty shallow shelves, and they were just kind of stacked up like specimens, or jars of pigment in them,
Mm-hmm.
And they were just, I don't know, I could feel they were really powerful. I mean, they're small but mighty, they're little things, but in the aggregate, when they're all together on this wall, it was just like, holy cow. I don't know. I feel like we could buy one, which maybe you'll dispute me on this. And I don't think they were very expensive. And I'm kicking myself for not having purchased one at the time.
Yes, no, absolutely. I sell them individually or as a whole bunch of them. And I think what's fun is that there's it's an open edition in that on a square of paper, there's usually 2 or 3 or 4 photographs. And so depending on how I wrap it, different photographs will be featured. And depending on how things dry or how it's folded, different elements will get hidden and others will be revealed. And so it was an interesting process to make them because I would spend all day with my family in this way of, okay, I'm going to be printing these photos today. So it's this strange process. I think for a lot of my work, a lot of it also involves text. So I'm either repeatedly writing out stories and feel like I'm spending time with different people that way, or I'm spending time working with all these photographs. So for me, the process of making the work has been a really wonderful journey of learning these histories and kind of spending time steeped in it. And then when I show them, then I get to share that experience.
Right. Yeah. And when you say photographs on things wrapped around the mold and everything, I think the quality of the image is probably not conveying. It's not a shiny gelatin silver print wrapped around something. It's the way they're printed. It's with printer's ink. And so they have this quality that's so antique in its way.
Mm-hmm.
You really get the sense that they're people from the past. And I think that it all came together so beautifully. So impressed with you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So let's talk about the writing. The works that you're doing with the writing are kind of also insanely wonderful.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I like to do things repeatedly, and small things are very exciting for me. So that kind of helps when you're looking at my work. I discovered that I could write really small. So I think working with the text came about because I was doing all of this research about all of this history, and I wanted to find a way to include everything that I was reading in the work because it was about so much and there's so many layers. And I was reading fiction, I was reading, historical records, I was reading newspaper articles, I was reading academic articles, and wanting some way to bring all of these different versions of history into one piece. And I had done, I would say, kind of a pilgrimage of sorts with my mom and my sister. We went out west to visit the campsite where my grandmother was interned and kind of do this loop of the interior of British Columbia, of where the different camps were. Then I started mapping out where this trip had taken us and what were the key sites that were specific to my own personal family's experiences, as well as kind of the broader Japanese Canadian experience of internment. And so then I realized that this incorporating text was a perfect way to explore this map. And so I've always had a love for etching, and working on a copper plate is just pretty exciting. And so I created basically a map of the interior British Columbia. And so from a distance, you can see there's about 10 different prints in it now, all installed on the wall in kind of what might look like a haphazard way. But when you get close, you'll see that each piece kind of connects and leads to the other. And when you get really close, then you discover that all of the roads and lakes and rivers are all made up of text. Usually I display the series with some magnifying glasses and encourage people to get up close. Some of the text is legible with a magnifying glass. Others is really not, because I've written on top of itself a few times to build up different tones and depth. And also in some of those maps, there's different pieces of paper that are layered on top of each other to veil different stories. In each of those different map pieces, I took text that was very specific to what was happening in those locations. So there's one piece called Revelstoke, and that's where my grandfather was sent to work on the road camps. And so all of the text in that piece is men's firsthand accounts of what it was like to work in the road camp. There's another piece that's called Slocan Lake, and there was about 6 or 7 different internment camps along that lake. And so the text in that piece, I used some text from a really wonderful Japanese-Canadian author named Joy Kagawa. So she wrote a book called Obasan. And so some text comes from that. And I had grown up, reading that in high school for school, and also earlier out of interest. And then I reread it as an adult. And I realized that what I thought had been my grandmother's experience was really the main character's story. So I was really kind of startled, and I loved your reaction there, Anne.
Sorry for listeners, my eyebrows are up in the top of my head. She was telling you the story that she had read herself as her own story.
Well, no. So this is what my memory had done.
Oh,
I had then taken, because they were in the same camp. So, it's a little bit more layered. So my grandmother was in Slocan Lake, Slocan City camp, and Joy Kagawa was also interned in Slocan City. And so the main character in the novel is interned, but I had then internalized this character's description as my grandmother's experience.
Gotcha. Oh gosh.
So, but I couldn't really tease that apart until I reread the book and went, oh, that wasn't the story that Bachan told me. This is from the book. I'm endlessly intrigued with how we conflate all of these memories and kind of the mess that it all becomes. So I used a bunch of text from that book, and then text also from a more contemporary academic who's looking at kind of the Japanese Canadian population that actually still is in those communities and what that looks like, and the memorial that's been built in one of those towns now.
Are the camps still there and visitable?
In New Denver, some of the original structures are there. Basically, a bunch of people had tuberculosis. And so if you were too sick or too elderly, you could stay in New Denver. But everyone else was moved away. So that's the only reason that those structures are still there. And they had built a sanatorium, and that's now the hospital, which, has clearly been renovated and everything.
Right.
So there is a memorial museum and garden that they've created in New Denver, which is this beautiful small town. But all the other sites are really are totally gone.
I think in the States, at least several of the camps are, visitable museums of a kind of Holocaust, right?
Yeah.
I'm surprised the Canadians are so much better at things than we are. I'm amazed that the camps
Some of them were,
survived.
I think it was about numbers, in terms of the sheer, just a kind of population difference. Some of them it was an old ghost town. That was an old mining town. And then, 1,000 people are going to live here and 1,000 people over here and housed in. So as I'm saying this, there are a couple other places. There was one hotel in Kaslo. So there are a couple different places that definitely have markers of history. Yeah, not quite like the pilgrimages that you can do in the States.
Print people will have heard you say that you were working on copper plates with this micro writing of yours. And they probably are immediately thinking, is she writing backwards?
No, I am definitely not that crazy. So this then comes back to working on Japanese paper. So I write all of this text forward, right reading, and then I print it, and it's backwards. And I print onto really, really thin Japanese paper. It's only 9 grams. And then I let everything dry, and then I wax the paper so it becomes more translucent, and then I flip it over.
Brilliant.
And so we're all looking at the back of the prints.
That's fascinating, really. I mean, because it feeds into your conceptual circle about hiding the histories, and it's kind of nuts.
And I think that's been so fun for me, and the challenges as we go on is kind of thinking is being so purposeful about the materials that I'm using and the different processes to tell different stories. Wanting everything that I do to have a reason, not just for aesthetics or not just for practicality. I mean, there's some things that are just practical, but for the most part, it's really trying to make it meaningful, either just for me and the process of making it, but for the final piece in the end, for sure.
Right. So, have you heard of an artist who works out of New York named Michael Waugh?
No, I haven't.
He's not a print person. He makes drawings, but he does it with that micrography, the tiny, tiny, tiny,
Gotcha.
tiny writing. And he is creating images that are kind of in the guise of more traditional, not Audubon, but like hunting scenes and kind of very traditional Americana kind of things. And the text that he's writing will be like the Supreme Court decision on,
Yes.
Citizens
I have
United.
seen this work. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Good. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we should introduce you because you have things to talk about. But using similar ideas, but both in a really great conceptual way that diverges.
Yeah. Yes. No. Thank you for reminding me.
Tell me about winning the award from the Queen of. I couldn't believe that whole thing about Queen Sonia. I mean, it was nuts. Tell us about it.
So in 2018, I won the Queen Sonia Print Award. Before that, I hadn't actually ever heard of the award and didn't know what was happening.
It's only been around since 2011, I think. It's not that old. Yeah, in your defense.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. It's an incredible award. It's, I think, one of the largest printmaking awards out there, and an incredible international recognition, and amazing award that gave me an opportunity to meet the Queen of Norway and be delighted by her wonderful presence and wonderful being she is. And the award itself is, and kind of the foundation that they've created is really fantastic in terms of what they're trying to do and growing printmaking and the recognition for it. But I think for me to win it, and the juries that are put together are pretty spectacular. To be nominated in the first part was a huge honor, and then to win, I was quite speechless. And it's been kind of a whirlwind since then, I would say.
It changed things for you.
Yeah, it really did. Lots of different opportunities have arisen in terms of making work, in terms of talking about my work and showing my work. It's really been a remarkable experience.
So then behind you on the bulletin board are two, I think those are etchings, I can't quite tell. And they are flat representations of the Furoshiki. And so now knowing you as well as I do in the last 45 minutes, I know there's some conceptual transition that happened to a flat sheet of paper.
So the piece that you're referring to are from a series called Generational Echoes. And so these prints, kind of linking back to the Queen Sonia, in addition to winning the award, I got a residency at Atelier Larsen, this amazing print shop in Sweden. And so I got to go for a week. And my conversation with Ulla, who runs it, said, let's make things that you can't usually make. And so we did really large photo etchings. So we did a suite of 9 of these behind me. And then we did 2 other super large ones, which were very exciting to make. And so when I was thinking about, okay, I'm making some large photo etchings, what do I want to do here? I was still in the midst of really making a lot of the sculptural pieces, the sculptural Furoshikis for an archive of Rememory. And I was thinking about these different generations of people I've been interviewing, the different generations of stories, and thinking about it from a very printmakerly way. The sculptures started out as a photograph, turned into a copper plate, turned into a sculpture. Then I take a photograph to document them and share those, on my website with all of show publicity, all of that sort of thing. And then I turned that photo documentation into another photo etching plate. And then we printed that onto Western paper. And all of a sudden there's a flattened sculpture, a flattened documentation of sculpture. Then these Furoshiki, they're larger than the original photographs. They're larger than the original Furoshiki. So scale is interesting, but you can no longer pick these pieces up. You can't hold them in your hand. You can't turn them around. You can't look at the photograph on the bottom of it. History has been flattened out to one perspective only in this. We've lost all those other angles. I know I was just, really intrigued with how we keep, I keep revisiting these different stories and looking at them from different angles. And so this felt for me like the next logical step. And it's been really wonderful to see them exist in this different kind of a space.
For the curator and me, it works completely because you're now sort of dropping a curtain in front of people. They can no longer manipulate it. And the fact that you've now put it on to Western paper, it's almost like you're whitewashing history for Caucasian people.
Mm-hmm.
Bravo.
Essentially, I haven't actually, when I said Western paper, I hadn't really thought about that. Yes, no, absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah.
I
The
knew I'd
Japanese
like
paper
you.
is gone. Yep.
I want more. What are you working on next?
Well, I'm currently on maternity leave with my daughter.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's a busy household. I have an almost 3-year-old and an 8-month-old.
Oh boy.
So there's not a ton of time in the studio these days. I'm working on some things. I have a solo show coming up in March in Toronto at United Contemporary, and I'm working on a collaborative project called Kimiko's Pearl, and it's an original ballet with original music that tells the story of the Japanese-Canadian experience during the internment. And so I'm creating some new artwork for that.
As in set designs?
As in, it'll be projected at different times in the ballet. So interesting to work in a digital format, kind of along the lines of what I've been doing before. So it's a new challenge for me, which is quite fun. And it's been really delightful to work with musicians and choreographers and writers and kind of seeing different creative processes come together. That's been ongoing throughout the pandemic. We started in early pandemic days on these Zoom calls, and it's been a delightful experience.
Lots of things were born in the pandemic. It's kind of amazing to me.
It is amazing.
It is
amazing.
You're also, when you're not on maternity leave, teaching full time.
Yes. Yeah. I do really love teaching, and I like the combination of teaching and of making my own work. What you're constantly reminded of with students, of the joy of print, the joy of learning a new process, and that excitement. And then it's lovely to come and work in my home studio and kind of be quiet and be focused and, get that energy from different sources and different people. It's a great balance.
Right. I feel like we could bring you down to MICA and have you talk to our people.
That would be great.
I feel like the students could get a whole lot out of your conceptual thinking. I mean, it's really, as a curator, the thing that makes me the happiest is probably a stretch. But one thing that elevates a work for me, just, beyond the stratosphere, is when somebody's paying attention to what materials they're using and what the technique is and how it's involved in what they're trying to say.
Yeah, hugely. Yeah.
Which seems so simple, but it's not easy.
It's not easy, and it takes a long time. And I think it's, it took a long time for me. It's like looking back, when you give artist talks to people, and I remember kind of going to see other artists, and especially as a younger student, it's this like, how do you have this career? How have you made this work? It's really easy to look back and see that route and see that path, and it feels totally logical. But in the midst of it, you don't know where you're going, or, you hit all these roadblocks. For me, that's also why I love to teach, because it's being able to help students through that path, and also remind yourself, I'll still hit those creative roadblocks of like, what's next. And
sure,
for me, coming back to the idea of printmaking and all of the different ways that you can use print, I think that at an early age, it was like, okay, I can do a lot of different things. I can make things a lot of different ways. So what's the best way to make this for kind of how I want it to look, but conceptually, what's the best approach? So I was thinking about that from an early stage of making.
I feel like there could be a really excellent exhibition if I had an institution to do it at. With you and Zarina, about borders and home and taking home with you and, what makes a home
Yeah.
and all that stuff. And then I know
Yeah.
there are other artists that should be on that list also, which
Yeah.
I'm not coming up with at the moment.
Yeah. No, that would be great.
Yeah. Great. I always loved her work too.
Yeah.
What's your best piece of advice for students?
Keep making. And I know that all sounds cliche and kind of what so many people say, but it's just about making. And I mean, even now being on leave and caring for an infant, it's this like, okay, I have an hour. I'm going to run down to the basement and I'm going to work for 5 minutes. And if it's longer, if I get a longer nap, then maybe I'm here for an hour. But I think what sustained me throughout my career and why I'm here is because I left school and I was just determined that I was going to make print a part of my life. And I found a studio where I could work, and the amazing necessity of needing a community studio. Then I was able to meet all of these people who were able to help me find other jobs and other teaching gigs. And it was, kind of finding that instant community was really helpful. But I think it was also just my determination to keep making work.
I think the community part of printmaking and the studios, I mean, it's not unique, obviously, to prints, but it is an overarching thing where you have this built-in sort of sounding board and ideas. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's so ideal in my brain as a way of thinking about and working. And I don't know, it's just
absolutely. Yes. Like print shops are a very special place.
Yeah.
And, if you're fortunate enough to live in a city that has one or in a community that has one, and if you don't, to then be able to go and do week-long intensive workshops or be able to immerse yourself in that environment is so helpful. Having been able to do different residencies along the way have been so invigorating. And then I love to come home and work on my own. And I was able to, get my own press several years ago. But before I had my own, it was, kind of figuring out what I could do at home and figuring out how I needed to work. That's some of the biggest advice I have for my students is just learning how your brain works and how you can help yourself think about work. And I grew up watching other people fill these beautiful sketchbooks and always being envious of those sketchbooks because my sketchbook wasn't full of drawings, it was full of writing.
Oh, interesting.
And then I learned that was okay, that I didn't need that sketchbook full of drawings, that for me, I come up with my ideas by writing them down and by, working through my process that way. And I think once I was able to give myself permission that that's how I work and that's how I think, it was so helpful and liberating. And so with my students, I always have this conversation of, who has this kind of sketchbook? Who has this kind of sketchbook? And it doesn't matter what it looks like. It's just about trying to help yourself get from one point to the next.
My lack of a sketchbook is exactly the reason I didn't stick with studio art. Because I can totally understand a student with a sketchbook full of writing thinking maybe I'm not legit somehow. Like I'm not drawing the thing that looks like the thing,
Yeah.
But for me, it was like, I just don't even have one. It's like, I love the idea of creating things. That is so cool. And I love looking at how you're thinking about things. But man, I just don't have that need to create every day. My podcast is my creation.
Hey, absolutely. Which is fantastic.
Yeah. Steep leaning curve.
We're all benefiting.
Yeah. Thank you. So in the show notes, I will include links to the show that's coming up and
fantastic.
Your portfolio and anything else you think would be important for people to be able to access quickly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Put your thinking cap on. I'll put mine on.
Will do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. No, that's great.
Okay. Well, thank you.
This was delightful.
Yeah, it was. It was great talking to you.
Yeah. Lovely to meet you.
Thank you so much for joining us for an episode with Emma Nishimura. I love her work and I hope you will check her out. I think she's amazing. Thank you as always to Michael Diamond for the use of his original music. And a reminder that any images we talk about will be over on the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. And also over there, as you well know and have heard me say one too many times, there's a support and donate button. Click it and help me keep the lights on here at Platemark. It's just me. All right, I think that's it. We will see you next time.